have been calls by different countries that Africa deserves a position at the G20, and the recent country that I think said that is India. India is hosting this year's G20 summit, and so it made these comments, and it's not the first time. I think there's been other countries inside the G20 that have also made these remarks before, that it will be important for Africa to be represented at the G20. Of course, African Union will be the institution to represent us at the G20. And so it just got me wondering, because there has been some calls from a few of our leaders on the need to reform the United Nations Security Council, and we know and be inclusive. And by inclusive, they mean that Africa should, at least by now, be represented at the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member, not the rotational 2-year thing we normally get. I think we have 2 slots. Every 2 years, we get a new member, and all that. And so they're saying it is important for Africa. A few of our leaders, Paul Kagame particularly, and I think Kenya's president, he reiterated those sentiments just recently, and a few others. And of course, former President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, the late, was very vocal about this, and Gaddafi also, and a few others. And so it got me thinking, what is the interest now they have, and what does Africa stand to gain in Africa joining the G20? And one of the arguments that I think India in particular was saying, a lot of issues that are being discussed there affects directly or has to do with Africa, and so it will be important for the person who is constantly being discussed and the issues being discussed. It will only be fair to have Africa being represented at the G20, which I think is not such a bad idea, and perhaps Africa stands to gain or not. You let me know. That is arguable, but I wondered, is this a diversionary tactic? Because there's been some leaders who have been consistent with the demand that the United Nations Security Council need to be relooked. The Constitution of the United Nations need to be relooked. Security Council need to be relooked, and for reforms to take place so that Africa, the United Nations Security Council becomes inclusive. Matter of fact, this is what the former African Union ambassador to the US had to say about this matter, and she has been consistent about this, Dr. Arikana.
We need to speak up. Okay. Why are we still going to the United Nations as Africans? That is a useless entity. It's not for us. The largest voting bloc in the United Nations are the African nations. We don't have a seat on the table. Why do we go there? We go to the United Nations to vote on their issues. They pay African countries, vote with us on this issue, vote with us on this issue. Mm-hmm. We have no business going to the United Nations, period. Right. We need to tell Secretary Guterres, thank you very much, but we're no longer going to attend United Nations. It's not our entity. Until we have true representation there. Goodbye.
Right. So of course, when the United Nations was being formed, a lot of African countries had not received their independence. The United Nations was formed after the World War II in 1945. It had been preceded by the League of Nations that was formed after the end of World War I in 1919. But because of certain prevailing factors at that time, the League of Nations failed. And one of the key things that the League of Nations was supposed to do is to prevent another war. And it was unable to do that. So after that, they hurriedly put together the United Nations, and so had a bit of reforms to ensure that the world does not return to another war. And we've seen even in the era of the Cold War that actually happened just after the end of World War II, from 1945 to all the way to late 80s and late 80s there. The Cold War lasted for nearly 40 years, but there was no direct aggression. So it is safe to say that the United Nations actually succeeded in one of its key roles, at that time that the League of Nations could not, and that is one, to stop war and to maintain peace and security in the world, among other things the United Nations does. The reason why I'm just revisiting this a brief history is for us to understand that when the United Nations was being formed, the issues and the policies and the agendas that necessitated its formation at that time only was centered around the Western world, Europe, the US, and Far East, and those other countries. Africa's voice and African issues were not factored in during that time because African countries had not received their independence. Okay, so decolonization processes, there was still some agitation, but had not fully started, because the first sub-Saharan African country that received its independence is Ghana, and that was in 1957, way a couple of years after the United Nations was formed in 1945. And so it is fair to say that the United Nations as it is today does not fully capture the aspirations and is not fully inclusive, as so many other people have stated, and especially Africa has been vocal on this. But they don't bring up this history, okay? So is it perhaps about time that the United Nations was reformed so that it becomes inclusive and the over 1.2 billion voices in this continent can be fully represented? Okay, and if not, what should be done? Should Africans continue going to the United Nations, as Dr. Arikana there has asked? She's saying there's no need for us to be going there. What do you think? Should we continue going to the United Nations, knowing fully well that we are used as a rubber stamp to the issues and the powers that be and the international politics, like we have been seeing lately, happening? Or should we pull back and say, until we have a proper representation, until we are fully represented and the United Nations has gone through reforms that represents the whole world as it is and the realities that we're dealing with today? Because remember, it was formed after the World War II. So the issues that pushed for its formations and for the reforms outside of what happened with whatever preceded it are different. Okay, the agenda then was different, the issues were different, the problems that they were grappling with at that time are different, and I know it has gone through different reforms and all that, but do you feel the United Nations is comprehensive, has captured the aspirations of Africa, of Asia, of the Middle East, of the Far East, of everybody in this global system? Because as it is now, it is very Eurocentric. The international system still is very westernized, very Eurocentric, okay? So it does not fully capture, and that is because when it was being formed, Africa did not have a voice there. We were still under colonies. And then another very important issue, while I talk about we're still being colonized, it is the colonizers who set up this institution. Outside of Russia did not colonize any country in Africa, and that's why some other countries in Africa have a soft spot for Russia, in case you're wondering, okay? And so it was formed by the colonizers. While they were forming the United Nations, they're still colonizing Africa. And so the issues as they are and the representation could be very much so, as Dr. Arikana is saying, it's not for our best interest. So now what must we do? That we gain independence, the first African country over 60 years ago? The policies are still the same. The United Nations Security Council composition is still the same. Should there be a change? And what should Africa do to push for the changes at the United Nations and to ensure that our voices are captured and it is all inclusive? Should we stop going? Should we continue going? What is the way forward with this? I'd like to hear your opinion on this matter.